You're looking at a scene that has become all too common in the District of Columbia. Flashing lights, police tape, and young lives lost too soon.
An 11-year-old Davon McNeil,
15-month-old Carmelo Duncan.
A 12-year-old boy was walking with his stepfather.
No one has been arrested for killing this little boy.
It's devastating.
We are African American Black women who have sons of our own. We're afraid for ourselves and our children in the DC streets.
These women did not want their faces shown on camera, but they did want their voices heard. They say constant exposure to violent crime has ruined their mental health.
Being someone who already suffers from mental health issues like PTSD, it also furthers my PTSD and anxiety.
What neighborhood are we standing in?
We are in Hillsdale, one of the amazing historic neighborhoods in Ward 8 here in Washington, D.C.
Can you give me your name?
My name is Darrell Gaston. I'm currently Advisory Neighborhood Commissioner for 8B03.
Gaston's neighborhood includes the 2400 to 2600 block of Elvins Road Southeast. MPD data shows in the last 3 years, this stretch of road has had 28 violent crimes involving guns. That's more than any other block in the district. How many homicides have you seen physically in this area around here?
On this street, we have 2 this year. That's not counting the dozens of shootings that we've had that did not succumb to homicides. One street over, there was another homicide. There was another homicide on Gainesville, which is about 300 yards from here. And so every day it's living in fear.
You were saying kids are walking, talking as these shootings occur. That is incredibly scary. I mean, let's say the kids don't get hurt, but mentally, I mean, that affects their lives.
It does, it does, and that's why mental fitness for us is really important.
Just 2 years ago, Gaston founded the Gerald Project to address the mental trauma locals receive from gun violence. The organization's named after his 15-year-old godson who was gunned down in D.C.
Kids nowadays have lost 2 to 3 friends to the gun violence. Kids in our communities, adults in our communities have PTSD, and we're told not to cry.
You have people who are living in conditions where they're constantly exposed to violence, continuous trauma. My name is Joseph Richardson, professor at the University of Maryland, College Park in the Department of African American Studies.
Richardson is also the executive director of the university's Transformative Research and Applied Violence Intervention Lab. He uses the 2 busiest trauma centers in the state of Maryland to conduct his research on the trauma of gun violence. A lot of times when people think of gun violence, they think of the victim. But as we were talking over the phone way back when, this impacts everyone that the victim knows.
So what we found in our previous research with caregivers of young Black men who had been shot, they were also suffering from symptoms of traumatic stress. So the same symptoms that young men who had been violently injured from firearm injury would have suffered, we found the same sort of injuries with mothers, their romantic partners, their wives, their sisters, and other family members, such as hypervigilance, hyperarousal, sleep disturbances, irritability, but they often suffer in silence.
When you're talking about hypervigilance and the anxiety that comes along with that, how does that stress the mind and the body?
So for hypervigilance, it keeps someone in a state of fight or flight, and it also produces a psychological response and a physiological response, which produces stress hormones.
And he says those stress hormones can become toxic.
And they begin to weather on your organs and wear on your organs.
Richardson points out the African American community already suffers from increased rates of hypertension and cardiovascular disease. Mix in the mental trauma from violence with the factors he calls structural violence east of the river, things like poverty, food deserts, and police stops, and you ultimately get a deadly cocktail.
Which is why you'll find in a neighborhood like Woodley Park, the life expectancy is 89.4 years compared to St. Elizabeth, which is 68.4 years. And we need to address that continuous and complex trauma, but the only way to do that is to be able to provide people with the mental health resources and access to those resources within those communities.
Unfortunately, such resources are still few and far in between in Southeast DC.
How do we take the stigma around mental health and focus on mental wellness and getting yourself together? But the only way to do that is to try to help people who don't know they need help.